The first sound you hear is silence, but it is not the silence of peace. It is the silence that follows when every whisper has already been planted, when every shadow in the room has already been taught to watch you. It was the winter of 1894 in New England, and a man named Walter Vance was already dead before his heart stopped beating. His executioners left no blade, no noose, no poison. They left him with something far more lethal. Thoughts that were not his own. Thoughts seeded in his mind until they grew into a forest of paranoia so thick no sunlight could reach him. He wandered those woods until the only way out was madness. And there, in the cold attic of his home, he broke apart. Not from sickness, not from alcohol, not from accident, but from whispers placed like nails hammered into his skull. Every creak in the rafters became a code. Every look from a neighbor became an accusation. Every moth upon the wall became an eye that never blinked. By the time Walter's body collapsed, his mind had been shattered so completely that his death certificate may as well have read, "Murdered by rumor." The culprits had names. Robert Blackwood, the patriarch, a man whose wealth and hypochondria made him believe he could control both sickness and society. His son, Thomas, a young dandy whose vanity was sharper than any dagger, and Eleanor, the matriarch, who feared shame more than she feared God, and for whom silence was both shield and sword. The Blackwoods were not killers in the way the law understands. They were worse. They were engineers of perception, masters of psychological sabotage. In a world obsessed with the visible wound, they perfected the invisible one. But if Walter Vance was their victim, his widow Elara was their reckoning. She did not choose mourning. She chose revenge, and not revenge by blood, not by the blade, but by a weapon as unseen and as corrosive as theirs. She would poison their minds, not their bodies. You must understand something. In that era, New England's small towns were built not on brick and stone, but on reputation. To die dishonored was to be erased more completely than if you had been buried in an unmarked grave. The Blackwoods knew this truth and used it like a cudgel. They whispered, they forged, they planted lies until Walter Vance's name was dragged through the snow. He began to believe the lies himself. That was their genius. That was their cruelty. But Elara found something they did not expect. Among Walter's belongings were journals, desperate, frantic notes scribbled in the last months of his life. At first glance, they looked like the madness of a broken man. Scrawled words, repeated dates, names circled in trembling ink. But Elara read them differently. Each line was a breadcrumb. Each paranoid entry was not delusion, but evidence. Her husband had not been insane. He had been documenting the sabotage as it unfolded. Every false whisper traced back to the same root, every humiliation crafted by the same three faces. And when she laid the journals out before her, grief hardened into clarity. She remembered her father's cottage at the edge of town, a place that smelled of dried roots and powders, a place where knowledge of herbs was passed down like scripture. He had taught her how to measure tinctures, how to weigh powders, how to ease pain with a drop, and how to end life with just a few more. To him, it had been a sacred science of healing. To her, in that moment, it became the architecture of vengeance. So she lit the lamp, she opened the books, she learned again, but not as a healer, as a saboteur. Every herb became a weapon. Foxglove could shake the rhythm of a heart. Sage, in the wrong ratio, could disturb the mind's rest. Powders meant to cure fever could instead bring visions. She did not want them dead. No, death would be mercy. She wanted them to walk Walter's path. She wanted them to doubt their own senses, to see phantoms that did not exist, to feel madness crawling across their skin until their own minds became prisons. The Blackwoods had turned perception into a weapon. Elara Vance would master it. She would become the mirror they could not bear to look into. And so the stage was set. The widow in black, overlooked, underestimated, forgotten by society, walking back into the house of her enemies under the disguise of service, needle and thread in her hand, but vengeance in her heart. This is the story of how one woman waged war without raising her voice, how she took the same invisible chains that had strangled her husband and wrapped them around the necks of the family who believed themselves untouchable. But what you are about to hear is not just the story of a widow's revenge. It is a map of a darker truth, that the deadliest wars in history are not fought with armies, but with perception, that every mind is vulnerable to a poison no physician can diagnose, that the most powerful prisons are the ones we cannot see. And before this December says, "It is over," you will begin to wonder, what whispers have already been planted in your mind? Which of your thoughts are truly your own? Because once you hear what I am about to reveal, you cannot go back. The Blackwood Manor stood high on the hill like a fortress of polished lies. Its slate roof glistened with winter frost, its brass fixtures gleamed in the grey daylight, and its stone walls whispered the arrogance of money that believed itself immune to consequence. To the townsfolk below, it was a house of order, of influence, of impeccable reputation, but to Elara, it was a theatre of cruelty, and every actor inside it had already written her husband's death sentence. Yet when she crossed its threshold, she did not come as an accuser, nor as a widow looking for sympathy. She came as something far more disarming, a seamstress, a servant, a shadow. Eleanor Blackwood, the matriarch, had summoned her under the pretense of repairing fine gowns that demanded hands more delicate than her own staff possessed. It was perfect. The Blackwoods, in their vanity, had written their own invitation to their undoing. From the moment she entered, she knew her invisibility was her greatest power. Robert Blackwood, with his cane tapping against the floor, barely looked at her when he passed. Thomas, with his perfectly groomed hair and mirrored smirk, saw her as no more than furniture. Eleanor regarded her only as a useful pair of hands. They did not see her grief. They did not sense the storm. They saw only utility, and in their blindness they welcomed the very architect of their unraveling into their inner sanctum. Elara's silence became her weapon. As she stitched hems and mended seams, she listened. Every careless word dropped into the air became a brick in her design. Robert's obsession with his health, his collection of pamphlets on heart palpitations, his muttering about circulation, his ritual tea at precisely 4 o'clock every afternoon, Thomas's vanity, the endless oils, the powders, the tonics arranged before his mirror as though his reflection were an idol to be worshipped. Eleanor's fear, the endless letters she wrote, folded and sealed, sent out into the world to control the whispers before they could ever reach her door. Each habit, each ritual was a doorway, and Elara, the widow cloaked in black, held the keys. At night she returned to her father's cottage and recorded everything. Her notebooks became maps of their weaknesses, their obsessions, their blind spots. She wrote in neat columns. Robert, tea at 4 o'clock, tremor in hand. Reads pamphlets on circulation, obsessed with moths in curtains. Thomas, vanity. Hair tonic, never without mirror, easily unsettled if reflection disturbed. Eleanor, gossip. Reputation fragile. Despises whispers more than facts, keeps her letters as weapons, but she was not merely observing. She was preparing. On her workbench, beneath the dim flame of her lamp, bottles lined up like soldiers awaiting command, tinctures measured drop by drop, powders fine enough to vanish in the steam of a kettle, liquids shimmering faintly under glass, their potency hidden beneath a mask of normalcy. She did not brew to kill. That would have been too easy, too merciful. She brewed to unmake, to turn perception against perception, to give them visions they could not explain, sensations they could not trust, terrors that no doctor's hand could cure. And so the first strike was prepared. Robert Blackwood, the patriarch who believed himself a scholar of sickness, a man convinced that every ache was a sign of decay, became her chosen beginning. He lived by pamphlets and clung to diagnoses like scripture. What better prey than a man already halfway to believing his own body was betraying him? The tincture she prepared for him was subtle, tasteless, invisible. It would not kill. It would not even wound. It would simply bend the edge of his reality, just enough to make him question, just enough to make him afraid. The next day she carried her sewing basket into the Blackwood home as though nothing had changed. She mended a tear in Eleanor's gown, tightened the seam on Thomas's coat. Then, when the hour struck 4 and the tea tray was prepared, she moved silently through the servants' corridor. A drop, no more than that. A drop in the teapot as steam rose around her hands. When Robert Blackwood lifted the porcelain cup to his lips, he tasted nothing but the bitterness of the leaves. The ritual continued as always, but within the hour his world began to tilt. The fire in the hearth felt too distant, the air in the room pressed too heavily on his chest, and when he looked to the corner of the room, he saw it, a black moth clinging to the curtain, its wings spread wide, its bead-like eyes glistening as if fixed upon him. He froze. His cane clattered against the chair as he staggered forward, but when he tore back the curtain, there was nothing, only fabric swaying in the draught. His hand trembled, his heart raced. He pressed his palm against his chest, whispering to himself, "Circulation. It must be circulation." But the seed had been planted, and Ilara, watching from the shadows, knew the unraveling had begun, because the most terrifying weapon in history is not the sword, not the gun, not the gallows. It is the whisper that convinces a man his own mind has turned against him. And Robert Blackwood had just heard the first whisper. The Blackwood household had long thrived on control. Control of wealth, of whispers, of appearances. But once Ilara placed her first drop into Robert's ritual, that control began to fracture. He no longer trusted the stillness of his own rooms. His cane tapped with agitation, not authority. His eyes lingered too long at the corners, where shadows seemed to pulse and breathe. The moths returned, always at the edge of vision. One night he jolted awake to find 3 perched on the canopy above his bed, their wings blotting out the lamplight. He struck at them with his cane, shouting, until Eleanor rushed in with a candle. There was nothing there, only fabric and silence. But the damage had been done. The patriarch who once wielded fear against others had begun to fear the very air around him, and Ilara, silent, dutiful, ever-present, tightened her stitching and offered no comment. Her presence became part of the furniture, the unseen witness to his descent. She did not need to speak. The poison was not in her words, but in his imagination. Yet Robert was only the beginning. Thomas Blackwood, the son, was next in her design. Unlike his father, Thomas had no obsession with sickness. His weakness was vanity. Every morning he worshipped at the altar of his reflection, combing his hair, arranging his collar, tilting his jaw to catch the perfect angle of light. To him the mirror was not glass, it was scripture, and Ilara knew scripture could always be rewritten. She waited, observed, noted the bottles of hair tonic, the powders for complexion, the brushes laid with religious order. Then, in a moment when his chamber was unguarded, she placed her hand upon the altar. One vial was altered. A clear tonic now shimmered with the faintest trace of her craft, harmless to the skin, but powerful to the mind. A single dab would distort the eyes, bending lines, bending proportions, twisting reflections just enough to stir unease. When Thomas stood before his mirror that evening, he smoothed his hair as always. The first stroke of the comb passed without notice, but the second revealed a line too sharp along his jaw, as though his own bone jutted at a strange angle. He blinked, leaned closer. The reflection blinked a moment too late. He stumbled back. His breath caught. The mirror, once a loyal confidant, had become a traitor. The perfection he trusted to define him now shifted with every glance. He splashed water on his face, cursing the lamplight. But the distortion remained. A man obsessed with beauty had just been taught that beauty itself could not be trusted. And still, Ilara said nothing. She adjusted seams. She stitched buttons. She bowed her head in silence. But each night, in her father's cottage, she recorded the cracks. Robert, moths at corners, heart unsteady, speaks of unseen watchers. Thomas, reflection betrays him, grows restless, combs hair compulsively, mutters to himself. The ledger of vengeance was filling, but Eleanor remained. The matriarch was not ruled by sickness or vanity. She was ruled by reputation. Every letter she wrote, every tea she hosted, every calculated smile in the marketplace was meant to sculpt a fortress of untouchable respectability. To Eleanor Blackwood, ruin was not death of the body, but death of the name. And Ilara knew names could be poisoned as easily as veins. Her weapon would not be tincture nor tonic, it would be rumor, seeded carefully, passed like a contagion through the mouths of servants, through the ears of neighbors. A whisper here, a suggestion there, all too faint to trace back, yet sharp enough to cut through the fortress Eleanor had built. For Eleanor's prison was her image, and Ilara held the key to turn admiration into mockery, trust into suspicion, dignity into disgrace. The Blackwoods had not yet realized it, but war had already breached their walls. It was not fire, not sword, not noose. It was perception itself. The same weapon they had once used to destroy Walter Vance was now turned inward, blade first, and the widow in black stood silently among them, stitching the fabric of their clothes while unraveling the very fabric of their minds, because vengeance is never loud. True vengeance whispers, and whispers are what the Blackwoods had always feared most. By early spring, the Blackwood Manor was no longer the polished fortress it pretended to be. Behind the stone walls, a different architecture was forming, one of fear, suspicion, and decay. Ilara moved through the halls like smoke, unseen yet present everywhere, carrying her sewing basket in daylight and her invisible arsenal in silence. The unraveling had only just begun. Robert Blackwood's visions multiplied. The moths that clung to his curtains now followed him into the study. He swore they crawled over the spines of his medical pamphlets, whispering in languages he could not understand. At night, he heard the wings in his bedchamber, soft at first, then thunderous, until he woke gasping and clutching his chest. Eleanor summoned doctors, but every physician who examined him found nothing. No disease of the heart, no fever, no tumor, no plague. Circulation, they muttered politely, indulging his fears. But Robert knew. He had seen them. And each time the doctors left, he collapsed deeper into the realization that the sickness was not of the body, but of the unseen. Thomas fared no better. The mirror, once his most trusted ally, had become his executioner. He could not pass a reflective surface without flinching. At times his face appeared bloated, his lips purpled as though strangled by invisible hands. At others his eyes seemed too large, bulging with accusation. He smashed 2 mirrors in a single week, shards scattering across the polished floor, his fists bloodied. When Eleanor scolded him, he turned on her with wild eyes. "You didn't see it. You didn't see how it changed." He avoided guests, grew restless, muttered to himself in corridors. Servants whispered that Thomas had inherited some secret madness, a curse running through the family blood. But the curse was not in that blood. It was in the air Ilara had been feeding him all along, and Eleanor, proud, imperious Eleanor, began to feel the tremors in her own fortress. For all her posturing, she was more vulnerable than either Robert or Thomas, because her power rested on the most fragile thing of all, reputation. Ilara had no need to poison her tea or alter her reflection. She only needed to bend the whispers that floated through the town, a careful word left in the ear of a servant, a rumor seeded at the edge of a marketplace conversation. Eleanor Blackwood can't control her house. Her husband sees phantoms. Her son smashes mirrors in madness. These were the whispers that spread like frost across glass, thin, delicate, yet impossible to wipe away. Soon, Eleanor noticed it. The glance of a neighbor that lingered too long, the way parishioners in the church pew shifted ever so slightly away from her, the silence in conversations where her name once commanded respect. Reputation does not shatter all at once. It erodes, grain by grain, until the structure you built your life upon feels unstable beneath your feet. Eleanor began to write more letters, sending them to friends, cousins, distant contacts, frantic attempts to stitch back the fabric of her name, but even her words could not keep pace with the whispers. And through it all, Ilara remained silent. Her needle passed through fabric, her hands steady, her face veiled in mourning black. To them, she was a servant beneath notice. But in truth, she was their judge, jury, and executioner, all in one. Every glance, every tremor, every mutter, every whisper was another note recorded in her invisible ledger of vengeance. Robert's paranoia, Thomas's vanity cracked, Eleanor's reputation bleeding out through silence. Piece by piece, the family who had orchestrated Walter's death were now walking into the same labyrinth they had built for him. The difference was that Walter had stumbled into it unknowingly, unarmed, broken. Ilara was guiding them into it deliberately, one step at a time, until they could no longer find the way out. And as she moved through their rooms, as her presence lingered in the background of their lives, the truth became undeniable. The widow had become the Blackwood's shadow, and shadows do not leave. Shadows grow, for vengeance is not about killing the body. Anyone can do that. True vengeance is about killing the soul, stripping away certainty until the victim begs for death just to be free from the endless assault of their own mind. The Blackwoods had not yet reached that point, but they would, and Ilara Vance would be waiting, needle in hand, smile hidden beneath the veil. By the summer of 1894, the Blackwoods could no longer keep their decay contained within stone walls. What had begun in whispers of paranoia and quiet distortions now bled into public view, and in New England society, nothing spreads faster than the scent of weakness. Robert Blackwood was the first to betray himself before others, once a man who walked through town with his cane striking the cobblestones like a declaration of superiority. He now lurched from step to step, muttering under his breath. The moths followed him even in daylight. He swore they clung to his sleeve, hid beneath his hat, perched on the shoulders of those who dared greet him. One afternoon during a gathering at the tavern, he erupted in a shout so loud it silenced the room. He tore at his coat, claiming moths had nested inside. When men rushed forward to steady him, they found nothing, only his trembling frame and wild, frantic eyes. He stumbled home that evening not as the patriarch of wealth, but as a spectacle of disgrace. The whispers that had once been his weapon were now turned against him. Robert Blackwood's mind is gone. The mighty have fallen. Thomas's undoing was more violent. His vanity, once his armor, had become his executioner. He refused meals, spending hours before the mirror, trying to catch his reflection in the act of betrayal. Servants reported hearing him scream at his own face, smashing a third mirror in a fit of rage. Glass littered his chamber floor like the shards of a broken self. His hands were cut and bloodied, his once pristine appearance marred by his own desperation. At night he paced the halls, running his fingers over his face as though trying to prove it was still his, but the reflection never agreed. The reflection showed him something uglier, something monstrous, something decaying from within. The servants began to avoid him, stepping aside as he passed, whispering of curses and madness. Thomas heard them, and every whisper deepened the crack in his mind. But the true heart of the unraveling was Eleanor. For Eleanor's empire was built on reputation, and reputation is a kingdom that burns quickly once the fire is lit. She sensed it first in the silence at church, where once neighbors nodded to her with respect. Now they looked past her, pretending not to see. She heard it in the marketplace, when conversations hushed the moment she approached. She read it in the clipped words of letters returned without answer. The rumors were subtle, but merciless. The Blackwoods are cursed. Robert sees demons. Thomas has gone mad. And worst of all, Eleanor cannot control her house. In a society where a woman's power was measured not by her wealth but by her ability to manage appearances, this was a death sentence. Eleanor wrote frantically, sending letters to every distant cousin, every social contact, every old acquaintance who might vouch for her. But words on paper could not silence the whispers already roaming the streets. She confronted Robert in his study, her voice sharp, her face pale with fury. "You are destroying us," she hissed, clutching his trembling hand as he muttered about moths that no one else could see. She struck Thomas across the cheek when she found him raving at his mirror, demanding he compose himself. But authority had slipped from her grasp. Her family was no longer feared. They were pitied, and in New England society, pity is just another word for death. Through it all, Elara remained silent. She sat with her sewing basket at the edge of rooms while arguments flared, her needle flashing in the dim light. She offered no counsel, no comfort, no reaction. She stitched gowns, she mended coats, she blended into the background while the family unraveled before her eyes. But each night, when she returned to her father's cottage, her pen recorded the progress like a scientist noting the stages of an experiment. Robert whispers in tavern, public disgrace, mutters to himself constantly. Thomas, hysterical before mirror, self-inflicted wounds, servants whisper of curse. Eleanor, reputation bleeding, letters answered fury rising. The widow's ledger was filling, and vengeance was unfolding with the precision of a symphony. But Elara knew patience. She had watched her husband die piece by piece, not in a single night, but in months of torment that hollowed him from the inside. She would grant the Blackwoods no quicker mercy. Their ruin would be slow, deliberate, and undeniable, because vengeance, when properly crafted, is not a fire that burns. It is a frost that seeps into the bones, cracking them quietly until the structure collapses under its own weight. And so she waited, watching, stitching, feeding the frost, until the day came when their minds would turn fully against them. By autumn, the Blackwood house no longer echoed with authority. It pulsed with dread. The air inside seemed heavier, as though the walls themselves had absorbed Robert's mutterings, Thomas's cries, and Eleanor's frantic scribblings. Servants whispered of leaving, their wages no longer worth the chill that clung to every room. And still Elara stitched, silent, dutiful, her black veil concealing a gaze sharper than any blade. Robert Blackwood had crossed the threshold where fear becomes delirium. The moths no longer lingered in shadows. To him, they filled the house. He awoke to their wings covering the ceiling, their bodies suffocating the firelight. He would strike at empty walls, his cane splintering wood, his voice rising in shrieks that carried down every corridor. One night he stormed from his study into the dining hall, overturning a table, shouting that moths had crept into the silverware. Eleanor's guests froze in horror, their eyes darting from the patriarch to one another. When no insect appeared, only silence and Robert's gasps, the whispers that followed spread faster than wildfire. The mighty Robert Blackwood, undone by shadows only he could see. Thomas, meanwhile, was no longer merely haunted by his reflection. He had become enslaved to it. He stopped leaving his chamber altogether, terrified that his face would betray him in the light of others. Servants heard him screaming at his mirror late into the night, accusing it of treason, demanding it show him his true self. One morning, his fist went through the glass, blood streaking across his jaw. When Eleanor found him, his eyes were wild, his hair unkempt, his voice trembling with a broken laugh. "Mother, it smiles when I do not." He staggered toward her, shards in his hands, as if to prove the reflection's betrayal by force. She recoiled, horrified, and for the first time, Eleanor Blackwood feared her own son. And Eleanor herself was not untouched. Her fortress of letters, her kingdom of appearances, was crumbling. Invitations to dinners ceased. Replies to her correspondence grew fewer, colder, and eventually stopped. In the marketplace, women who once sought her approval turned their backs. She began to sense eyes following her. Not moths, not mirrors, but human eyes, the eyes of neighbors who whispered and then fell silent when she drew near. Every glance felt like a dagger. Every laugh bare in her felt directed at her name. She confronted Robert in despair, begged him to control himself, begged Thomas to restore dignity to their house. But authority had evaporated from her voice. Robert muttered only of wings. Thomas laughed bitterly into shards of broken glass. And Eleanor turned at last to desperation. She called for Elara, the widow she had always regarded as a servant, a shadow, a seamstress fit only to mend her gowns. But when Eleanor Blackwood summoned her, it was not for sewing, it was for counsel. "Tell me," Eleanor whispered one evening, her voice trembling, her eyes red from sleepless nights. "Have you heard what they say? About us? About me?" Elara lifted her gaze just long enough to let silence fill the space between them. Her needle moved slowly, her face veiled, unreadable, and then she lowered her eyes again, offering no answer. That silence was worse than words. Eleanor's breath caught, her gloved hands trembling against the chair's armrest. She had ruled her house by reputation, but in that moment she realized something unthinkable. Even the servant she barely acknowledged could not, or would not, defend her name. The fortress was already burning, and she had no soldiers left. But Eleanor's mind was sharp, and for the first time she began to suspect. Whispers do not spread themselves, shadows do not grow without movement. She began to watch Elara with wary eyes, though she dared not accuse. To accuse a widow, to accuse the silent seamstress who carried grief like a shroud, would risk sounding mad herself, and Eleanor Blackwood knew that madness was a whisper away from ruin. So she said nothing. She seethed in silence, but in the pit of her stomach she felt it. The Blackwoods were not collapsing by chance. Something unseen was orchestrating their fall, and Elara, needle in hand, smiled where no one could see. Because vengeance is sweetest not when your enemies die, but when they begin to suspect you, and realize they can never prove it. The Blackwood Manor, once a beacon of stability, had become a theater of chaos. By late autumn, no one in town spoke of the Blackwoods with respect. Their name had become a spectacle. Children whispered it like a ghost story. Neighbors muttered it like a warning. The once feared family was rotting in full view of the community that had once bowed to them. Robert Blackwood's ruin was complete. He had once strutted through town with a spine stiff as iron. Now he stumbled down its streets with eyes darting like prey. He no longer muttered quietly. He shouted. At church, in the pews meant to symbolize dignity, he leapt to his feet mid-sermon and screamed at the rafters. "They are here, watching us." His cane clattered to the floor as his voice cracked into sobs. The congregation stared in horror as Eleanor tried to hush him, but it was too late. The whispers rushed out of the church like a tide. Robert Blackwood, patriarch, undone before God and man alike. Thomas had descended beyond whispers. His chamber was a wreck of shattered mirrors, broken glass crunching beneath his boots. He no longer trusted reflections in windows, in spoons, even in pools of water. Every reflective surface was his enemy. When servants crossed his path, he seized them by the collar, demanding they confirm what they saw in his face. One made escape, with bruises. Another left the house altogether, swearing never to return. The household grew emptier with each passing week, until even the staff knew. The Blackwoods were cursed, but Thomas's violence turned inward too. The vanity that had once been his sanctuary was now his tormentor. He clawed at his own skin until it bled, convinced the face in the glass was not his own, but some impostor. At night, his cries echoed through the halls. "Give it back! Give me my face!" Eleanor locked her door, trembling at the sound of her son's rage beyond the wood. And Eleanor, the iron matriarch who once held her family's dignity like a scepter, had become a ghost of herself. Her letters went unanswered. Her guests stopped coming. Even the church, once her stage, now turned its gaze away. Her every move was judged, her every silence twisted into evidence of weakness. She was no longer the guardian of reputation, she was the subject of gossip. But Eleanor still possessed one weapon, suspicion. She began to watch Ilara. The widow who had slipped through her halls unnoticed for months now seemed too steady, too calm. While the family unraveled, Ilara stitched in silence, her hands never trembling, her voice never breaking. Eleanor could not prove anything, but in her gut, she felt it. The widow was not mending. She was dismantling. One evening, Eleanor confronted her, her voice low and sharp. "Do you think I do not see you?" she hissed, standing in the parlor where the curtains smothered the last light of day. "Do you think I do not know that shadows walk with you? You stitch and stitch, but it is not fabric you repair. It is something else, something darker." Ilara lifted her eyes, only briefly, her face hidden beneath the veil. She said nothing. She returned to her work, needle-piercing cloth, steady as heartbeat. The silence was heavier than accusation. It was dismissal. Eleanor's fury trembled in her chest. But she dared not speak more, dared not name the suspicion aloud. For to accuse a widow, a seamstress, a woman veiled in grief, was to risk ridicule, to sound like her husband raving about moths, to sound like her son screaming at mirrors. And so Eleanor choked on her own suspicion. But Ilara knew. The matriarch had begun to sense her hand in the ruin, and that was exactly how vengeance is perfected. When your enemy realizes too late that they are trapped, and that the hand choking them has been at their throat all along. The Blackwoods' world was collapsing, and Ilara had only begun to tighten the noose. Winter descended upon New England with a silence that felt heavier than snow. The town lay beneath a sky of iron, the streets empty, but the Blackwood Manor throbbed with noise, the noise of collapse, of a family strangled by its own unraveling. And Ilara, silent and veiled, drifted through its corridors like a shadow made flesh, the architect of a ruin no one could see, yet everyone could feel. Robert Blackwood had ceased to be a man of wealth or influence. He was, now, little more than a husk wrapped in trembling flesh. The moths that haunted him no longer lurked in corners. They filled his vision entire. He swore their wings brushed his skin, that they crawled across his pillow, that they nested in his lungs. He ripped at his clothes until they hung in tatters, clawed at his chest as if to dig them out. His cane was abandoned, his steps erratic. The patriarch of the Blackwoods, once feared for his authority, now cowered in the corners of his own house, begging the unseen to leave him be. The town no longer whispered pity, they whispered mockery. Robert Blackwood, they said, the great man eaten alive by moths. Children laughed when they saw him stumble in the snow. Shopkeepers looked away when he raved in the marketplace. His wealth could not shield him. His name could not protect him. The Blackwoods had lost the only currency that mattered: respect. Thomas, meanwhile, had passed the edge of hysteria and crossed into violence. His reflection no longer taunted him quietly. It mocked him with every glance. He smashed not only mirrors but windows, accusing the glass itself of lying to him. His hands were shredded with cuts, his face streaked with scars of his own making. Servants no longer dared approach him. Those who remained locked themselves in their quarters at night, praying his rage would not find them. One night, the household woke to screams that shook the walls. Thomas had dragged a servant into his chamber, demanding she tell him if the face she saw was his. When she stammered in terror, he struck her. Again. Blood stained his hands and the floorboards, and by the time Eleanor burst in, her son stood over the girl with eyes wild, chest heaving, mirror shards glittering at his feet. Eleanor pulled him back, shrieking, but in his fury he shoved even her aside. For the first time, the matriarch saw her son not as heir or pride, but as monster, and still the widow stitched in silence. But it was Eleanor herself who bore the cruelest blow, for her fortress was not her body, nor her son, nor even her husband. Her fortress was her reputation, and that fortress had now been set aflame. Elara did not need tinctures for Eleanor. She needed only a whisper released like poison into the air of the town. Eleanor Blackwood is the cause, not her husband's madness, not her son's violence, hers. She brought something into the house, the whispers claimed. She trafficked in things she should not have touched. The Blackwoods are cursed because of her. It was subtle at first, the way all true poisons are. A servant repeating a rumor at the well, a shopkeeper mentioning it under his breath. But it spread, as rumors always do, faster than fire, faster than truth. Soon, Eleanor could feel it in the eyes of the townsfolk. When she walked the marketplace, women pulled their children aside, men lowered their voices as she passed, neighbors turned their backs. Her fortress of dignity collapsed in silence. For Eleanor knew the truth. Reputation is never taken. It is given away piece by piece until nothing remains but ruin. And hers had been stripped bare one night. She sat alone in the parlor, letters scattered before her, all unanswered, all useless. The fire had burned low and the lace curtains loomed like funeral cloths. She pressed her hands to her face and whispered, "What have I done? What have I allowed?" In the corner, unseen, Elara threaded her needle, the faint scratch of thread against cloth, the only sound in the dying firelight. Because vengeance does not strike quickly, it waits, it festers, it grows until even the proudest bow beneath its weight. And Eleanor Blackwood was bowing now, her spine bent not by age, but by whispers she could not silence. And still the widow remained silent, watching, stitching, waiting for the moment when the family's ruin would be complete. Because the cruelest revenge is not killing your enemies, it is making them live long enough to know they are already dead. By the turn of the year, the Blackwoods no longer resembled a family. They resembled a ruin. A house with walls still standing but hollowed out from within. Each of them moved through the manor like ghosts, their minds consumed by shadows they could not name. And in every room, Elara's presence lingered, steady, veiled, a reminder that vengeance works best when it is patient. Robert Blackwood no longer left his bed. The man who once walked proudly with his cane now trembled beneath blankets, muttering about wings that no one else could see. He clawed at the sheets, insisting moths nested inside them, insisting they whispered his sins into his ears. His body grew frail, his eyes sunken, his lips cracked with constant murmuring. He had not been poisoned in body, but he looked as though he were wasting away from disease. Every doctor Eleanor summoned left shaking his head. Nothing physical, they said. The sickness is of the mind. But Robert knew better. "They've come for me," he rasped, voice thin as paper. "They've come to finish what they started." Thomas had grown dangerous. His chamber, once filled with perfumes and combs, was now a battlefield of shattered glass and bloodied rags. He trusted no one, not his mother, not the servants, not even himself. When he caught sight of his reflection in a polished spoon at dinner, he hurled it across the room, screaming. Eleanor tried to calm him, but Thomas seized her wrists, demanding she swear the face she saw was his. When she hesitated, even for a breath, he shoved her back with such force she collapsed against the wall. Eleanor's cry echoed through the hall, and for the first time she feared her son more than the whispers of the town. And the whispers, they were merciless. Eleanor Blackwood, who once reigned over society with her chin held high, was now spoken of only in mockery. Her husband is mad. Her son is cursed. Her name is poison. The matriarch who built her life upon reputation found herself shunned even in church. No one sat beside her pew. No one offered her hand. She was alone, surrounded by murmurs that hissed louder than prayers. Elara had placed no tincture in Eleanor's cup. She had slipped no powder into her food. She had not needed to, for Eleanor's poison was isolation, and it was working. At night, Eleanor sat in her parlor surrounded by stacks of unanswered letters, her fingers trembling as she read them over and over, as if repetition could summon replies that would never come. She pressed her hands to her face and whispered, "It cannot end this way. It cannot." But it could, and it would. Elara's journals were nearly full. She had tracked every stage of their unraveling. Robert, bedridden, mutters of moths, body wasting though no sickness found. Thomas, violent, distrusts all. Reflection, his enemy, lashes out against mother. Eleanor, reputation destroyed, whispers unrelenting, dignity shattered. The ledger of vengeance was complete. But vengeance is never satisfied with suffering alone. It must have closure. It must have a final act, a climax that seals fate beyond doubt. Elara knew this. She had studied it in the slow torment of her husband's death, and she now prepared it for the Blackwoods. One last whisper, one last strike of perception, one last unraveling that would ensure the Blackwoods were not only destroyed, but erased. The town already believed they were cursed. The servants already believed they were doomed. All that remained was the final push. A whisper so sharp it would slice through the last of their defenses and leave them bleeding in the open. And when that moment came, Elara would not need tinctures, nor mirrors, nor rumors. She would need only silence. The silence of a widow who had outlasted them. The silence of a shadow that had become their executioner. Because vengeance is never about the strike. It is about the moment your enemies realize the strike has already fallen, and that the wound was opened long before they ever felt the blade, and the Blackwoods were already bleeding. The Blackwoods' ruin did not come in fire or blood. It came in silence, the kind of silence that follows when every whisper has already taken root, when every reputation is already ash. By the winter of 1895, the manor on the hill was no longer a fortress. It was a tomb. Robert Blackwood died first, though no doctor could explain how. His body simply gave out. They said his heart failed, but the truth was simpler. He had starved on fear. He had been eaten alive by moths no one else could see, gnawed not in flesh, but in sanity. When they lowered him into the earth, the town did not speak of legacy. They spoke of madness. His name had been erased before the coffin shut. Thomas lasted longer, but his death was uglier. In the dark hours of one winter night, his screams tore through the manor. Servants found him sprawled in his chamber, glass shards embedded in his hands and arms, blood pooling at his feet. He had smashed every reflective surface, every mirror, every polished plate, until nothing remained but fragments that reflected back 1,000 twisted faces. His last words, choked through blood and laughter, were, "It isn't mine. It never was." And then the Blackwood heir was gone, destroyed not by blade or poison, but by the betrayal of his own reflection. And Eleanor, proud, imperious Eleanor, she did not die of wounds or disease. She lived long enough to watch everything crumble. Her husband, mocked. Her son, disgraced. Her own name, dragged through the mud, until the very church pews recoiled from her presence. She became a recluse, curtains drawn, letters unanswered, voice silent. Some say she lost her mind. Others say she remained sharp, but simply broken. The matriarch imprisoned not by walls, but by the knowledge that reputation, once shattered, can never be rebuilt. The Blackwoods' name vanished from the town's lips, Once feared, once respected, it became nothing more than a warning story, a ghost tale whispered to children by firelight. Do not speak too highly of yourself, or the Blackwood curse will find you. And through it all, the widow lived. Ilara Vance did not gloat. She did not confess. She did not need to. Her revenge had not been in striking blows or leaving corpses. It had been in returning cruelty with cruelty, in turning the Blackwoods' own weapon against them. They had killed Walter by poisoning his perception. Ilara had avenged him by poisoning theirs, piece by piece, whisper by whisper, stitch by stitch, until they could not tell truth from illusion, friend from foe, self from shadow. And when they died, they did not die as feared elites. They died as madmen and cowards. That was her victory. But here is the truth you must take with you. This story is not confined to the past. The widow's revenge is not only history, it is a map, a revelation, because perception has always been the sharpest blade. Control what a man sees, what he hears, what he believes. And you control his very existence. Governments know this. Institutions know this. Families with power have always known this. The most dangerous prisons are not built of iron, they are built of whispers. And you, listening now, must ask yourself, whose whispers already shape your mind? Which of your thoughts are truly yours? Which are seeds planted by hands you cannot see? Because once you recognize it, you cannot go back. Type this phrase twice in the comments to lock it into your soul. I see the poison now. Write it, and let it anchor you against the whispers that would rule you. The Blackwood. ODS could not withstand the poison. Walter could not, but Ilara could. And she turned it back on those who wielded it. This is the lesson buried in their ruin, that the deadliest wars in history are not fought with swords, but with stories. That the deepest wounds are not carved in flesh, but in the mind. That the sharpest poison leaves no taste, no trace. Only silence, only madness, only ruin. The year was 1894, when the widow began her revenge. The year was 1895, when the Blackwoods fell. But the year it reaches you is now, and now you know the truth. The only question is, what will you do with it?